I'm Jennifer, the Inquiring Quilter. Welcome to another episode of Intelligent Quilting, where you learn the reasons behind the various methods in quilting, and so you can choose one that works best for the project you're doing right now. Today's episode is about 32 at a time half square triangles. So you would use this method when you need to make a lot of half square triangles that are the same, that have the same two fabrics. And it is a very quick method. It is also a very easy method to do and produces a stable, and by that I mean a half square triangle that does not have stretchy bias on the sides. So it's an awesome technique to add to your toolbox. Let's talk about the tools that you'll need. In this method, which is very much like the 8 at a time method and also the 2 at a time method, it is useful to have some kind of marker. So fabric marker, I use a mechanical pencil whenever the fabrics are light because I'm marking on the back, so it's okay. If the fabrics are dark, I use this. This is a sew line mechanical pencil, and it is specifically for marking on fabric, and this one happens to be white, so I use it when I have dark fabrics. Other tools that are useful: you will be trimming these half square triangles down. So this method is one of those in which you make them slightly larger than you need to be, and then you trim them down to size. This helps even a beginner make accurate half square triangles, which is another reason why I like this method. So you'll need a ruler. A ruler that's a square is great because it has a 45-degree line. It needs to be larger than the half square triangles that you're trimming to. So as long as you've got a ruler that's bigger than that. Something that is extremely useful are these half square triangle trimming rulers. These two are the ones I like. They're by Quilt in a Day. They're called the triangle square up rulers. They come in different sizes. This is a 6.5. This is a 9.5 inch one. There's also a smaller one. So you just need a ruler that's bigger than the size you're trimming to. This one trims up to 6.5 inches. You'll see that these rulers save you half the time in trimming. And that's why I recommend them. When trimming, you're going to be using, of course, a rotary cutter. It's nice to have a rotating cutting mat like this, both for marking your squares prior to sewing and also for trimming up later, because you're going to be trimming all 4 sides of a half square triangle, and you don't want to be doing something like this where you're cutting over yourself and possibly you could nick yourself. You don't want to do that with a rotary cutter. Something else that I like to use are pins. Because the squares that you need for a 32 half square triangle at a time method are large, because the squares are large, you'll want a pin so that the 2 fabric squares don't shift as you're sewing. I always recommend Best Press. It is wonderful. It's a starch alternative. It helps get your fabrics flat, so you should use it before you cut, because if you have an accurate cut, that is one more thing that enables you to end up with accurate half square triangles. So use your Best Press prior to cutting, and then also when you're pressing. Speaking of pressing, I like to use a wool pressing mat and also a tailor's clapper. When we get to the pressing part, I'll show you why those are important. Something else that would be very useful for this is a long ruler, because again, the squares are really big, and so as you're trying to mark them, a long ruler will really help. So those are just the tools that I recommend for this method. As always, I will provide a link to the tools that I've just talked about in the description so that you can go take a look at them and shop online and get them for yourself if you want. Also, I don't want to forget, because I'm about to go to the math, I will also include in the description of this video a half square triangle cutting guide, a free download from my website, so that you don't have to know the math for each of the different kinds of half square triangle methods. The chart will just tell you. So speaking of math, Because this is a similar method to the 8 at a time half square triangle method, it's something that the math you may already know about. You take the finished size plus an inch, then multiply that by 2, and then multiply that by 2 again, because the first part gets you the 8 at a time measurement, and then times 2 will get you the 32 times measurement. So let's say I wanted to make half square triangles that are 2 inches finished. So I'll take 2 inches plus 1, that's 3, times 2 is 6. If I was making 8 at a time, I would cut 6-inch squares. I'm making 32 at a time, and so that's an 8, 8, 8, and 8. So I'm going to multiply by 2. I'm going to take this square and have another one that way. So 6 inches times 2 is 12 inches, so I need 2 12-inch squares to get 32 half square triangles that match. Let me show you how to mark. First of all, let's take a look at our fabrics. I've got these 2 fabrics here. We're going to be marking on the back, of course. This is a solid, so it's the same front and back. And this one I could mark with a dark pencil line, so I could use my mechanical pencil here, and it'll work just fine. This one, it occurs to me, because of how dark it is, if I was to use my sew line pencil, which is white, I will really see those lines. So I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to mark on this one. So let me show you how to mark. You're going to need your long ruler. And the first thing you want to do is mark from corner to corner in both directions. So I'm going to just twist my rotating cutting mat, and I'm going to mark corner to corner in this direction, and then corner to corner in the other direction. Let me make sure I get right in that corner there. Now I've got those 2 lines. Now I need a line going from top to bottom and from side to side. So you can use your ruler to tell you exactly where that center line is. This is a 12-inch square, remember, so I'm measuring 6 inches from this side. And that'll be my center line. I will turn, do 6 inches from the other side. There we go. And make sure that's going right in the center there. Now I have my 4 lines. The next thing I need to do, it's kind of like you're doing 4 8 at a time half square triangles. So now I've got this quadrant here, this quadrant here, this quadrant here, this quadrant here, and I'm going to mark them all the same. So I just need one more diagonal going through each of these 4 squares. So I will turn my rotary cutting mat and mark the diagonal of this first square. Mark the diagonal of this next square. Mark the diagonal of the next square. And of the final square. Now I've got everything marked. When we go to the sewing machine, which is the next thing we're going to do, we're not going to be sewing these lines here, the one that goes from top to bottom and from side to side. Those lines are not there for you to use when sewing. They're there for you to use when cutting. So just keep that in mind. Let's put our fabrics together, right sides together, and then I'm going to pin and take it to the sewing machine and sew. Here's my pins. And I like to pin outside of where I'm sewing. Remember, these diagonal lines in each of the squares is where we're sewing. So I'm pinning in these quadrants here. I guess I don't really have to pin in the center there, but it does help. So I think I will, because that way when I cut these apart, they'll, well, anyway, they won't shift anytime while I'm sewing. I was just thinking when I cut these apart, but I won't have the pins in them there then, so I don't know, you don't really need. So let's pin in the areas where we are not sewing. Then I go ahead and pin in the center. What the heck? Can you tell I was a Girl Scout? It's kind of like be prepared. So I'm putting way more pins in here than I need. But that way I know that these two squares are not going to shift. And it will remind me that I'm sewing on these diagonals and not on these two long lines. All right, so everything is pinned. Let's go take off to the sewing machine and I'll show you how to do that. So hi, I'm at my sewing machine. I forgot to show this earlier, but this is a 1/4" seam marker. You've probably seen it in some of my other videos. I can, now that I have marked these lines, I could have gone back in and used this to mark either side, which would be my sewing lines. The reason I didn't do that originally is because this thing is just not long enough. There, it's just not long enough to do that diagonal. But you can, if you're not a person with a very accurate 1/4", you could go ahead and mark your sewing lines. However, remember we did add a fudge factor into this, so you'll be fine. I'm going to sew a 1/4" on either side of this line. And that's it. So let's go. By the way, if you press your seams open like I do, you'll want to reduce your stitch length, and I have already done that. After you've sewn these two long diagonals, now we're going to sew the diagonal within each of these little quadrants. Again, both directions. Let's see. Go this way. You may have noticed that at the corners here, all I did was use my knee lift to lift the presser foot. I didn't cut threads or anything, I just kept on sewing. And you can do that on this inside part as well if you want. So I have sewn the long diagonals, and I've sewn all the way around on both sides of that line. I did not sew, I ignored the top down and side to side lines. Those are for cutting. So now that we're done, we'll take this down and press and cut. Oh, by the way, I used a highly contrasting thread here so that you could see what I was doing. I obviously would normally pick a thread that would match my fabrics a little bit more, or at least not contrast so much. So I might use like a medium to dark gray on this one. Hi, we're back from the sewing machine where I have sewn all my lines. And it's time to cut everything apart, and this is where you get to see the magic. Before you cut anything apart, I always like to set the seams. So I will do that with my iron. My iron is set to on dry cotton setting, so it's nice and hot, but it's a dry iron. I like not to have steam in my iron because that can interfere with bias and stuff like that and possibly make things stretch. So I have effectively set my seams. So now it's time to cut everything apart. Like I said, the long line this way and that way are for cutting. So let's do that first. Oh, why do I set my seams? It helps the threads go into the fabric a little bit and really makes for a stronger seam. I think I'll just measure from the edge. So now I've cut these four, oops, well, I thought I did, cut these four apart. And I have 4 squares now. So you could treat each of these 4 as if it's the 8 at a time method. And that just makes it simpler. So I'm going to take these away for just a second. And at this point, I think it's going to be easier if we cut the up and down and side to side cuts, because you'll see in just a second what that does is that gives you a very familiar object. If you've done 2 at a time, you know what to do at this point. You need to cut those down the diagonal. But if you want to save some time, you can put them back together and make a single cut using your rotating cutting mat. First there was the Rotary Cutter and rotary mats and rulers. Then somebody invented the rotating cutting mat, and God bless them, because, you know, look at that. So I have 8 here, and each of these will also give me 8. So now these half square triangles are ready to be trimmed up to size, so I can get rid of my big ruler and use a smaller ruler at this point to trim them up. And let me show you how I do that. Just need one. So first let's press this open. I like to press my seams open. I told you that earlier, but you can press to the dark. If you wanted to press to the dark, finger press first. Then use the nose of your iron to nudge that over just a little bit. And then I will sit that on there to let it warm up. My iron wasn't 100% warm, so I'm gonna let it sit there for a second. The heat from the wool mat is radiating up, so I'm pressing it from both sides, essentially. At the very least, I'm heating it from both sides. Then I will press this side, iron this side, and put my clapper on top. The clapper, the wood of it is weighty, so it presses down and helps to flatten that seam. Also, it does radiate some of the heat back down, so again, really makes it for a flat half square triangle. Now let's trim. I'm going to use a square ruler that has a 45-degree line on it, and the ruler just needs to be bigger than what I'm trimming to. I'm trimming to 2.5 inches. So I'm going to lay the 45-degree line on the diagonal of my half square triangle and trim these two sides. Then I'm going to lift my ruler, and let's just lift my ruler and rotate and place it back on. This time my 2.5 inch line is exactly on those freshly cut sides. The diagonal is on the diagonal of the half square triangle. I'm going to cut this side and rotate the mat and cut the other side. That way I'm not cutting into myself. Voila! A perfect 2.5 inch unfinished, 2 inch finished half square triangle. Let me show you some steps that can help speed up the trimming process. So let's start over with another one of our half square triangle units. And instead of using this ruler, let's use a half square triangle trimming ruler. In this case, I'm going to recommend a Quilt in a Day triangle square up ruler. This is 6.5 inches square, so it's big enough for cutting the 2.5 inch unfinished half square triangles. You'll notice that the ruler has lines. I need these 1/2 inch lines. I'm going to use this 2.5 inch mark for my 2.5 inch unfinished triangle, because that's what I'm trimming to. I'm trimming to 2.5 inches, so I'm going to use that line. I'm going to place it on, that line goes right on my seam line. And then I'm going to trim this side and trim this other side. Notice I did my trimming before I pressed. So by trimming 2 sides, I'm actually trimming all 4. So let me show you something else I do when pressing. I like to press my seams open. My clapper happens to have wool on top and it's rounded, which really helps open up that seam. There. And you use the nose of your iron to really press open that seam. And then press and clamp. Now, the only problem with this is that you'll notice there are dog ears. That's these little triangles, small triangles that stick out on the side. They add bulk to your seams, and they may even kind of throw off your mind visually as to how to put the squares together, because there's this extra thing hanging out there. So you kind of want to get rid of the dog ears. Let me show you that you can, and while also saving time trimming. So let's go back to our ruler. Again, I'm going to use the 2.5 inch line on my seam. By the way, you can, if you want, trim up one side and make a single cut. This one doesn't look like I can do that, but if it was even on both sides, I could trim up one side. And by making a single cut, trim my triangle. Okay, so I've trimmed it. Now I flip the ruler over, and I'm going to use that 2.5 inch line on my seam line. And notice the 2 dog ears. You just go like that, and then rotate your mat and trim that one off, and you've just trimmed off the dog ears. So when I go to press this open, and if you don't have a clapper, by the way, you can just finger press the seam open, and then use the nose of your iron gently to spread that seam open and get a perfectly flat seam. Again, you're pressing, not ironing. And then I'm going to use my clapper on top of that to press the seam down. Then I will press from the other side. And that I usually do this, put the clapper on the freshly pressed half square triangle and then let it cool just a little bit, and that just sets it. The fabrics remember how you've pressed them, and they keep wanting to go back to that. So this results in a very, very flat unit, and it's perfectly to size, and it doesn't have any dog ears. So if you use one of these Quilt in a Day triangle square up rulers, you'll save yourself a lot of time when trimming with the 2 at a time, 4 at a time, 2 at a time, 4 at a time, 8 at a time, 32 at a time, however, trimming your half square triangles. There are other brands, so I will list all of these in the description of this video so that you can go check them out for yourself. I think that's it. I've got a lot of triangles now to be pressing, but I made them in just a few minutes, and I made 32, which is freaking awesome if you need to make a lot of the same kind for a quilt. Thank you for joining me. If you liked this video, please click the follow button. I appreciate that, and the like button, the thumbs up. I appreciate that as well. That helps other people find my videos, and it helps me out too. So I appreciate your patronage, and if you follow me, you will be notified the next time I upload another video. And by the way, let me remind you one last time that for the quilting math, if you don't want to have to do it, you just click that download link and download my half square triangle guide, which has been newly updated to include the measurements for 32 at a time. So even if you've downloaded it before, go ahead and download it again. You'll get the new version. So thank you for joining me, and see you on the internet. Bye.